What's up, metal and heavy music fans? These are my favorite new metal albums. Alright, so we have to kick things off with Limp Bizkit and Significant Other. Now, I know that Limp Bizkit, by all objective reasoning, is corny, it's kind of cringe, but god dang is it just fun. This album is just full of well-crafted songs. I mean, there's a reason it hit #1 on Billboard, making top sales alongside the likes of NSYNC and Britney Spears. Like, just take that in for a moment. How many metal albums have actually made those types of numbers before? Like, barely any. And it's something that I wonder if it will really ever happen again. Like, you can say what you want about the new metal era and the state of the genre at the time, but dang it, like, I miss hearing this stuff on the radio. Like, I would much rather hear Disturbed for the, 100th time than hear basically anything that the radio plays now. So you can partially, and honestly, largely thank Limp Bizkit for making that happen, for making this commercially viable, because ultimately, that's what pushes that stuff. The fact that they were so good at balancing the heaviness with the catchiness to pull in those new listeners, that's what allows them to, make this something that is on popular media that you can consume regularly. The audience chooses what ends up on those programs. And even if you don't like Fred Durst, which is perfectly understandable, I feel like you gotta respect Wes and also Sam, the bass player. Like, they put in some really great stuff. Like, Wes is the master of just taking the simplest riff, boiling it down, and just turning it into something that sticks in your head basically forever. And then the bass work on this album in particular, but really all the albums, even the lesser ones, is honestly pretty fantastic. Like, really, really great stuff. These guys aren't just complete dopes. They know what they're doing, especially in terms of marketing, but also, again, in terms of putting really great songs together. And this one has some of the best, including Nookie, Rearranged, and of course, Break Stuff. Just really entertaining album that I still unironically scream along to on a pretty consistent basis. Next up, we have Soulfly with Soulfly. How long can you lie? How long can you live with your soul split? How long can you live with your soul? Now, I know some of the Sepultura fans are going to kind of groan at this inclusion, but honestly, I've always preferred this side of Max's sound. I just find it to be much more interesting. I mentioned in another video too that honestly, as far as Sepultura's discography goes, I prefer Roots because it's kind of just a Soulfly album. And what makes it so great to me is that it's super angry and heavy, yes, really intense stuff, especially with the background, including that Max's, I think, stepson was murdered, and that was part of the inspiration for starting this project and some of the lyrics on this album in particular. But aside from that, you also get all these really cool regional influences that were just so unique. Like, at the time, you weren't really hearing too many bands doing this, and especially particularly from a Brazilian cultural standpoint. And so it's just really neat to hear all of that stuff mixed in with this really intense groove. Lots of great songs all over this thing, but also a lot of really great guest spots kind of co-signing it. Eye for an Eye is a great opener with a really awesome riff to kick things off, and that includes Dino and Burton of Fear Factory. You've got Bleed with Fred Durst and DJ Lethal, which, again, say what you will about Fred Durst, but this song is just a banger. First Commandment has Chino from Deftones, and then Quilombo has Benji of Skindred. So kind of covering a wide range of different vocal styles, and this continues on to the next album, Primitive, which is also a good one, but for my money, this is my personal favorite, and if you haven't listened to it, I really encourage checking it out. Next up, we have Static X with Wisconsin Death Trip. Another kind of unique standout on this list in that it's not just a new metal band. In fact, some people argue whether this is a new metal album at all. I tend to think so for a couple of different reasons I'll get into, but it's also just this awesome fusion with industrial metal that is done just better than I think any other album in this particular kind of sub-niche. You had a few other new metal albums kind of bringing in those industrial influences, but I don't think any of them do it quite as well as Static X, to the point that I feel like Static X, part of the reason they don't get called a new metal band is that people who generally don't like new metal don't want to include it in that label, so they'll call it basically anything else that they can think of and really kind of pull it more into that industrial metal zone. But there's still a lot here though. Like, you listen to a song like Push It, which is just like, it's a new metal staple. Like, it's got all of those elements. It's got the like repetitive groove to it that like really gets stuck in your head. It's got those like really simplistic but effective new metal riffs, and then their look too. I'll say new metal is kind of like, it's the groove plus the drip, if I could really like simplify it as much as I possibly can. There's other things in there too, like especially like hip-hop elements, but that's not always true. But I feel like those two things are always there, and let me tell you, Static X got the drip, y'all. Like, their look is just so unique, especially of course Wayne with that crazy beef stick hairdo. Like, he's the Slim Jim guy. Like, that, it was such a goof, and that was like just the cost of entry. But then luckily when you get in the door, the music is fantastic. So again, you've got Push It, I'm With Stupid, Bled for Days, is just a lot of like headbangers. And then you also get some more kind of interesting stuff like Stem, which is probably my favorite deeper cut on this album. It's got that weird like trancey ambient stuff mixed in with the heavy stuff. So very cool. Love this album. Then we have Taproot with Gift. So this is a pretty personal pick for me. Like, I think most of my other albums here are going to end up having a lot of overlap with other people's, but this one I think will be unique, and part of it is just because this was one of my first albums that few other people actually even knew about. Like, it was my first kind of like, ooh, this is like my underground thing that like is unique to me, and I get to tell people about it, which I think was like an early like Metal Trenches moment. So yeah, I know some of you who aren't as familiar probably heard that clip too and may not really be into those more nasally high-pitched vocals. Definitely kind of an acquired taste, but what I really love about this vocalist is those alternations between that nasally high clean singing and the screaming. Like, a lot of bands around this time were doing both singing and screaming, obviously, but I feel like this album has one of the best examples of those rapid changes between that, because it's not an easy thing to do. And then also infectious riffs galore. Like, Again and Again is the clip that I played at the top, and that's kind of like the big banger single, but you got plenty of other ones too, like Smile and Emotional Times, which not only have those really memorable guitar parts, but also really fun, memorable vocal parts that they know when to give those the space. Like, especially on Emotional Times, it kind of just opens with this quiet guitar. There's no drums. Mirror's Reflection is actually another one that I'm thinking of too. And then the track I is a little bit more thoughtful and expansive, and it's not complex by any means, but it's very kind of like sad, which, you know, there's some sad boy music in nu metal too, and I enjoy that aspect of it as well. So yeah, probably not for everybody, but this has always been one of my favorites since I first heard it. Back to a big one though, we have Linkin Park with Hybrid Theory. Now this is just an absolute classic. You cannot have this list without including this album, I feel like. It is just a staple. It was everywhere. It was inescapable, and I told this story on probably a couple videos at this point, but most recently, like my nu metal debut ranking list, which if you haven't checked that out, you probably should. Like, I remember hearing these songs for the first time on the radio in various places. I was working at the pool, I think, this summer, and this would get played over the speakers at the pool. And then we were walking to like our county fair one night, and Crawling was just like blasting so loud that you could hear it from like 5 blocks away. And again, like I said with Limp Bizkit, what other time can you think of where metal music was like that mainstream? And you can bemoan that if you want, but think about how many new listeners were brought into metal as a result of this. And it's just the starting point. Like, you got to start somewhere. I started with this kind of softer, more mainstream stuff, and now look at me, I'm listening to Imperial Triumphant and Gorguts. So you can complain all you want, but honestly, that is the main purpose of this channel. This is why I started Metal Trenches, is I want to draw people in with those more kind of like well-known bands, but then I want you to leave with those exciting new picks that you've never heard of before. And honestly, those are my favorite comments too, where it's like, dude, I'd never heard of this band before, and now I'm like their biggest fan. But anyways, back to Hybrid Theory. That was a bit of an aside there. Definitely got oversaturated because of the radio play, but for good reason. I mean, from front to back, this is just an incredible album. Like, half of it is singles, and I'm not even exaggerating there. Like, look up the album and look up which ones were charted singles, and I think like at least 5, maybe 6 tracks are included in that list. You got Paper Cut, Crawling, One Step Closer, In the End, which was probably the most overplayed one, but now it's kind of come back around and I enjoy it again. But then also some really good deeper cuts like A Place for My Head. There's really not a dud. I even like the just pure DJ track. What more can be said? Y'all, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you're new here, if you want more like this. And also, if you really want to support, I've got my new Metal Trenches shirts, and you can buy those at the store. It's on Big Cartel.
Merchandising! Merchandising!
All right, next up we have System of a Down with System of a Down. Now, I know most people would pick Toxicity as it's the more remembered album. It was definitely their breakout album, and I get that. Love that album. That was the first System of a Down album that I owned, but for my money, pound for pound, I think this is the stronger outing. This is one of the best nu metal debuts out there. Wild, just weird, crazy stuff, but a little bit more focused than I feel like Toxicity is, because Toxicity has some weird stuff, and as a result, I feel like the quality of the tracks sometimes kind of like dips into more literally like comedy metal territory, whereas here, the comedy and the satire is more woven into these, honestly, more complex arrangements. Like, System of a Down are very talented musicians in comparison to some of the other bands in the genre. I also think it has some of their best guitar work. Like, there's actually, in addition to the big chunky riffs, there's some wild other stuff going on. There's even a solo that is really fantastic that I love listening to even to this day. More consistent, too. Like, I just feel like every single track has something to offer. You've got the big ones like Sugar, which is just really fun. If somehow you've never listened to that track, there's a music video for it, and there is a sing-along, kind of like almost skit-like part towards the end that is just like, me and my friends imitated that even into college to no end. And then on top of that, you got Spiders for something a little bit more dark and atmospheric. You've got Sweet Pea, No, War, and my personal favorite on the entire album, Soil, which has another great scream-along part that those in the know what I'm talking about. And then that's the track 2 with probably some of the best guitar work they've ever done. If you somehow skipped over this to Toxicity and never revisited it, I highly recommend. It still holds up. Then we have Mudvayne with LD50. Easily Mudvayne's best album by like a mile, I would say. I don't really care much for the Mudvayne discography overall. You can check out my tier list on that one to hear my thoughts on all the other albums. But this one's great, and another one I listed very highly in my nu metal debuts. Like, not all bands are able to come right to the table with this really strong stuff. I know they had kind of like a demo EP kind of before this that was a little bit rougher, but this was their first major label full length, and it's just really fantastic. And not only that, but also surprisingly technical. In particular, their drummer and their bass player, Rhino, are just very talented individuals. Like, honestly, almost like too talented for the band, I would say. But they really get to shine on this one, incorporating a lot of different styles. From track to track, everything has kind of a different personality, yet it all sort of gets pulled together into this more almost conceptual sounding thing. Of course, you got Dig, which is now just like a meme. Like, it's transcended. It's been funny, like, as an adult now, to see stuff that was just popular when I was younger for its musical qualities to now just be like, I appreciate that's been rejuvenated again by any means, but now it's just like the bumper meme. Like, that's all that song is, but it's a great track. And this album's so much more than that, though. You've got Nothing to Gain, which is my personal favorite, which is actually conceptually about Ed Gein, the serial killer. Really great to scream along to, well arranged. You've also got Death Blooms, Internal Primates Forever. I will admit that this is a little bit bloated, but then again, I feel like most nu metal albums where it's like, oh, we've got all this extra disc space, so let's just like max it out. But in any case, yeah, if for some reason you have like never really dabbled with Mudvayne, this would be the one album that I would recommend. Next up is Slipknot with Slipknot. Now, these top 3 are really rough for me to rank. Like, honestly, they're all kind of like on the same level, and they're all so different too. they all have something a little bit special to bring to the table. So just take that into consideration as I'm listing off these final 3. I'll also say that I know a lot of people would pick Iowa, which is also a fantastic album. Those are really the only 2 Slipknot albums I truly love, but I still think this album wins. Because 1, it's the album that got me into metal, like in full, I would say. I heard plenty of stuff on the radio kind of building up to that moment because it was the 90s. Alternative radio was big. I was hearing all sorts of stuff, everything from Helmet to Korn, and that was sort of the primer. But this was the first full album that I truly dove into, and I never looked back afterwards. Like, I was just all in at that point. So it's definitely got some nostalgia, but it's also, I would argue, and I still do argue to this day, it's one of the heaviest albums ever written. Like, I know I listen to far crazier, more sort of intense stuff in death metal and avant-garde black metal and all this stuff that is easy to say that it's much more kind of quote-unquote metal, but in terms of just pure rawness and aggression in just a genuine unfiltered form, you can't get much better than the self-titled Slipknot album. Like, I still throw this on and I turn into that old angsty 16-year-old and I just want to fuck shit up. And on top of just how heavy it has great atmosphere too. I know we've been talking on the Discord and some people are saying they skip the more sort of atmospheric tracks, but to me, that's a mistake. Like, I think it all just comes together perfectly to this just dark, dank, dirty, and still heavy experience, and so many great tracks. You got Sick, Eyeless, Wait and Bleed, Spit It Out, Eternally imitatable in terms of some of Corey's vocal deliveries, and then even like the DJ scratching is somehow heavy. Like, most albums with a DJ on it, it comes off as kind of corny, but here, not so. Like, it doesn't feel like that hip-hop influence, which is fine, too. I enjoy that as well. But I just want to delineate that, like, Sid is probably, like, the heaviest DJ out there, and I wish they incorporated him more and more effectively into their newer songs. Then we have Korn with Issues.
Falling away from me, falling away from me.
Issues, to me, is, like, the GOAT. It's one of the greatest of all times, and it's just like, to me, honestly, it's like the perfect album. Like, I rarely say that, especially when I'm talking about this more nu metal style stuff, but if there is like a perfect nu metal album, I think this may be the one. Because like all of those key elements are on display, but just done better than ever before. There is not a dull moment on this track. I even love the interludes. Like, I think it really helps pull it all together. The production is the best that it's ever been. And it was another very formative album for me with just tons of singles that were playing all over the radio. Again, kind of like with Linkin Park, almost half this album was singles. And man, were they strong. You got Falling Away From Me, Make Me Bad, Somebody Someone. Falling Away From Me in particular, like that music video used to play like every morning on this, like, I didn't even have cable at the time, but there was this sort of like music video station that only played from like 6 a.m. to like 7:30 a.m. or something like that. And they always played this. And I just like lay on the couch tired, waiting to go to school and just zone out and watch the Falling Away From Me music video. Definitely Korn's most cohesive album too, and be sure to check out my Korn album tier list. I have 2 now, actually. I have one just on the artwork and I have one on the music. Obviously, big fan of these guys, and it was cool to see them drop yet another new album and kind of continue sort of a resurgence, even if it'll never be as strong as Issues. Oh, and quick shout out too, since I always do want to leave you with something a little bit more unknown, even when you come to these kind of bigger, more broad audience videos. Check out Tala. I've mentioned them a number of times before, but as far as like new metal bands go, their album Metriphagy is really fantastic if you love Korn and Slipknot in particular. But my number 1 pick, which should be no surprise to you regular viewers out there, is going to be Deftones with White Pony. Now, arguably, this album is not distinctly nu metal. It's where they're kind of like transitioning into that more kind of like post-metal, alt-rock kind of territory. But there's a lot of influences here, and I feel like there's enough nu metal on here that still warrants its inclusion. I could also go with Around the Fur, but to me, this was like the album. This was and still is one of my all-time favorite albums, period. Not just in nu metal or this era or in metal, like just period. favorite albums. And yes, all of it, like every single song, because again, I love albums that push boundaries and do different things while also like keeping it consistent, and White Pony is just like a masterclass in that. Every track is kind of giving you a slightly different flavor, lots of different ideas, but it's all very cohesive. It all comes together into this like perfect melting pot of ideas. Some people argue with that, but personally, that's my feeling on it. You've got your more ferocious, just hard-hitting tracks like Feodosira, however the heck you pronounce that, I never get it right, and Elite. But then you've also got these more atmospheric songs like Digital Bath, Teenager, Change, and Passenger. And I'll tell you, especially at the time, since I was also in love with Maynard and Tool and A Perfect Circle, being able to hear him on a Deftones track was just like, it's just perfection. And then my personal favorite deep cut that I still have in like regular rotation is Knife Party. Like that song just drops my jaw every time I listen to it, especially when you get into those guest vocals that have that like more ululated kind of regional style, but then they turn into these just like ear-piercing shrieks that every time I listen to them, especially as a kid, I was just like, how does your vocal cord even make that sound? Like, that's insane. But yeah, all said and done, just fantastic album, one of my go-tos to this day. And I know some people say it's overrated, and I can appreciate that, especially considering some of my overrated albums. But for me, this is just perfection. But y'all, let me know down in the comments, what are your top 10 favorite nu metal albums, and check out these videos for more thoughts on nu metal. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.